Without a doubt, the last century has been the century of the self, almost a glorification of the self, at least in the Western world. A common approach that has emerged from all of this is the also current idea that what we call the self must be reinforced so as to make it more rational, more confident, stronger. To say it all in a nutshell, this approach is both absurd and harmful. Unfortunately, not so many can see this. The attempt to also culturalize this trend, eventually shaping it into a part of the so-called common sense, is de facto a very dangerous approach. After all, we have been trying to reinforce the self for centuries through intellectuals, philosophers, social scientists, humanist writers, thought leaders, and so on. All attempts aimed at strengthening the self for ages, so as to make it better, more educated, more confident, powered, empowered, etc. But very little has been invested in attempting to actually understand very profoundly what we actually mean by self. Despite all of this reinforcement of the self has produced indisputably interesting currents, admirable schools of thought, and fascinating isms, nevertheless, the process of reinforcing the self has also created enormous problems that are also historically evident over the past centuries. A much healthier and so necessary approach certainly should not be based on cultivating the self, but rather pivoted on the understanding of its contents so as to prevent the self from interfering with the process of thinking. The very understanding of the contents of the self, the understanding of the harmfulness of the self, the understanding of the psychological gravitational attraction of the self, won't obviously lead to the dissipation of the self, but can instead breed the dissolution of the influence of the self and the interference of the self in the very act of thinking.